The family portrait hung in the entrance hall of my father's country estate, positioned so that every visitor would see it first. A deliberate staging of dynasty and legacy. In the painting, commissioned 15 years ago, my father stood at the center in his hunting tweeds, one hand resting proprietarily on the shoulder of my brother, who wore the same self-satisfied smile he'd been born with. My sister Brittany perched on the settee to the right, all elegant angles and careful pose. And there, relegated to the far left corner, slightly out of focus as if the artist had run out of interest or canvas, was me. Younger, quieter, already learning to be invisible. What the portrait didn't show, what no one in my family knew, was that 3 years after it was painted, I would make captain in the United States Navy. And what they definitely didn't know was that 1 year ago, when my father's financial troubles became serious enough to threaten the estate he'd spent 40 years curating, I bought it. The whole thing. 17 acres, the manor house, the guest cottage, every stick of antique furniture, and every oil painting in gilded frames. He never knew. I made sure the transaction went through a trust, anonymous and untraceable. He signed the papers, accepted the influx of cash that saved him from bankruptcy, and continued living in what he believed was his ancestral home, paying rent to a legal entity he never bothered to investigate. And I let him believe it, because watching people who underestimate you is its own particular art form, and I'd been practicing for years. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing deployment schedules aboard the USS Valiant. "Charlene, it's Victoria, my stepmother. She'd married my father 8 years ago, after my mother died, and had spent the subsequent years trying to reorganize the family hierarchy with herself at its apex. Victoria, what can I do for you? Your father passed away last night, heart attack. Very sudden." I sat down slowly. The deployment schedule's forgotten. I see. The funeral is Saturday. I assume you can get leave? I'll make arrangements. Good. We'll need to discuss the estate. There's quite a lot to sort through. Her tone suggested this would be primarily her sorting, with minimal input from me. The will reading is Monday. After we hung up, I sat in my quarters and thought about my father, not the man from the portrait, confident, established, certain of his place in the world, but the man I'd known in fragments, distant, preoccupied with status, always slightly disappointed that his youngest daughter had chosen military service over the kind of career that could be discussed at country club dinners. "What exactly do you do in the Navy?" he'd asked once, years ago when I'd made lieutenant commander. "I'm a surface warfare officer. I'm in line for a destroyer command." "Yes, but what do you do? What does that mean in practical terms?" "I lead sailors, make strategic decisions, manage complex operations." He'd nodded, his expression politely blank, and changed the subject to my brother's latest real estate acquisition. That conversation had taught me something valuable. My father's inability to understand my work wasn't a failing on my part, it was a limitation on his. And limitations, I'd learned, could be useful. The funeral was exactly what I expected, tasteful, expensive, and performative. My brother Julian arrived in a Mercedes, my sister in a Bentley borrowed from her husband's collection. Victoria orchestrated everything with the efficiency of a general, though her rank was entirely self-appointed. I arrived in my 12-year-old Subaru, wearing a simple black dress from Nordstrom Rack. "Oh, Charlene," Victoria said when she saw me, her tone carrying that particular blend of pity and condescension she'd perfected. "You're here? I wasn't sure if you could afford the plane ticket." "Military transport," I said, which was technically true. I'd flown commercial, but let her assume what she wanted. "Of course. Well, you're here, that's what matters," she air-kissed near my cheek. "We're all staying at the estate, naturally. I assume you've made arrangements elsewhere?" Actually, I was hoping. "The problem is space, darling. Julian and his family are in the East Wing. Brittany and Charles are in the guest cottage. And I simply must keep the master suite." She touched my arm sympathetically. "There's a lovely Holiday Inn about 20 minutes away. Very clean." Julian appeared at her elbow, drink in hand, surveying me with the same expression he'd use on a subordinate employee. "Charlene, good of you to come. How's the Navy treating you?" "Well enough." "Still doing that communications thing?" "Destroyer command, actually." He blinked. "Really? That sounds important." It is. Well, good for you. Government work doesn't pay much, but it's steady. He patted my shoulder. Dad always worried about you, whether you'd be okay financially, but steady is good. I smiled and said nothing. Let him think destroyer commands were equivalent to middle management positions. Let him think the 06 rank I held was some bureaucratic designation meaning nothing. The funeral service was lovely. The minister spoke about my father's contributions to the community, his business acumen, his devotion to family. People nodded and dabbed their eyes. I sat in the third row. Victoria, Julian, and Brittany had taken the front and thought about the estate. About the trust documents locked in my attorney's safe. About the careful architecture of secrets I'd constructed. At the reception afterward, held at the estate naturally, I overheard Victoria talking to a cluster of my father's friends. Of course, the estate will need to be managed carefully. My stepdaughters are lovely, but neither is particularly business-minded. And Charlene, she lowered her voice, though not enough. Well, she's in the military, poor thing. They don't exactly prepare you for property management in the Navy. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and wandered through the rooms I secretly owned. The library where I'd spent summers reading. The conservatory where my mother had kept her piano. The dining room where family dinners had reinforced, year after year, that success meant visible wealth, prestigious careers, the right kind of accomplishments. Never mind that I commanded a billion-dollar warship and 300 sailors. Never mind that admirals knew my name, that my tactical decisions were studied at the Naval War College. None of that mattered here, in this world of polished silver and inherited furniture, because it couldn't be quantified in terms they understood. And I learned to find that amusing rather than painful, to enjoy the game of their ignorance. The will reading on Monday was, as expected, a masterclass in Victoria's maneuvering. My father's attorney, a silver-haired man named Hutchins, read through the preliminary items with practiced solemnity. Small bequests to staff, donations to charities, personal items distributed to friends. Then came the main event. To my son Julian, I leave my collection of rare books and my stake in Noonan Properties, LLC. Julian nodded, satisfied. To my daughter Brittany, I leave my art collection and my investment portfolio with Burke Financial. Brittany smiled, squeezing her husband's hand. To my daughter Charlene. Everyone turned to look at me. I leave my military medals from my service in Vietnam and my collection of navigation instruments. The medals I'd never seen him wear. The instruments that had sat gathering dust in his study. As for the estate itself, Hutchins paused, his expression slightly uncomfortable. The house and grounds had been placed in trust for Mrs. Victoria Crane, with provisions for her lifetime residence and... Actually, I interrupted quietly, that's not possible. The room went silent. Hutchins looked up. I'm sorry? The estate can't be left to Victoria because my father didn't own it. Victoria's face flushed. That's absurd. Of course he owned it. He lived here for 40 years. He lived here, yes, but he didn't own it, not for the last year. Julian was frowning now. What are you talking about? I pulled a folder from my bag and handed it to Hutchins. Transfer of deed, dated 13 months ago. The estate was sold to the Valiant Trust, a private entity. My father retained lifetime residence as part of the agreement, but ownership transferred completely. Hutchins opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. His eyebrows rose steadily as he read. These are legitimate deed transfers, notarized, recorded with the county. I don't understand, Brittany said. Dad sold the estate? To whom? The trust doesn't disclose that information, Hutchins said carefully. It's a private entity, structured for anonymity. Quote, Victoria had gone pale. This is some kind of fraud. It must be. Your father would never sell this estate. It's been in the family. For 40 years, I said, not generations. He bought it in 1985 with money from his first big development deal. It was never a family estate in the traditional sense, just a very expensive house he couldn't actually afford to maintain. How do you even know this? Julian demanded. I pay attention to things, unlike some people. But who bought it? And why would Dad agree? Because he was broke, I said simply. The 2008 financial crisis hurt him badly, then the bad investments in 2019. By last year, he was facing bankruptcy. The trust offered him a solution: sell the estate, remain as a tenant, and use the capital to restructure his debts. Victoria was shaking her head. No, he would have told me. We would have discussed this. Would you have? Or would he have been too proud to admit he'd failed financially? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Hutchins was still reading the documents. Miss Crane, these appear to be legitimate. If the estate was sold prior to your father's death, it wouldn't be part of his estate to distribute. The will's provisions regarding the property are null. But I live here, Victoria said, her voice rising. My home is here. You can't just... The trust's terms included lifetime residence for your father, I said, not for his spouse. You'll need to negotiate with the trust for any continued tenancy. Negotiate? This is outrageous. Who do I even negotiate with? The trust's legal representative. Hutchins can provide contact information. Julian was staring at me with new calculation in his eyes. You know a lot about this trust, almost like you've been researching it. I'm thorough, I said. Military training. Where are you living these days, Charlene? Brittany asked suddenly. You said you couldn't stay at the estate because there wasn't room, but where did you stay last night? The Holiday Inn Victoria recommended. Very clean, as advertised. But where do you live normally, when you're not deployed? I smiled. That's complicated. Navy housing varies depending on assignment. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. The full truth was that I owned a townhouse in Alexandria, a condo in San Diego, and now a 17-acre estate in Virginia that my family was currently sitting in. But they didn't need to know that yet. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria made increasingly frantic attempts to contact the Valiant Trust. Hutchins provided the necessary information, but the trust's representatives were polite, professional, and entirely unwilling to negotiate lifetime tenancy for anyone except the deceased property owner. She'd need to vacate within 60 days. Julian called me 3 times trying to get information about the trust. Someone must know who owns it. You were always good at research. Can't you find out? These trusts are structured for privacy. Wealthy individuals use them all the time. But who would buy Dad's estate? Someone with money and interest in the property? That's not helpful, Charlene. Sorry, I'm just a Navy communications person. This isn't really my area. I thought you said you did destroyer commands. Same thing, basically. It wasn't the same thing at all, but Julian wasn't about to research naval command structures to verify. Brittany was more direct. This is your fault somehow. I don't know how, but you're involved. Me? I can barely afford my own rent. Then how did you fly here? Military transport doesn't cover personal travel. I have savings. Some of us budget carefully. She'd glared at me but couldn't push further without sounding like she was accusing me of something she couldn't articulate. The estate sale was Victoria's idea, announced via a group email that arrived while I was conducting training exercises off the coast of North Carolina. Dear family, given the unfortunate situation with the estate, I've arranged for an auction of the contents. Your father's furniture, art, and personal items will be sold to help cover transition costs. The sale is scheduled for the 15th at 2 p.m. Family members are welcome to attend and bid, though I hope we can handle this gracefully. Please let me know if you plan to come. Victoria. I read it twice, then forwarded it to my attorney with a single line. Is this legal? His response came within an hour. Technically, she's a resident removing personal property before vacating. Unless someone objects officially. Do you want to object? No, I wrote back. Let it play out. Then I requested 3 days, leave, and booked a flight to Virginia. The estate looked exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks earlier. Immaculate grounds. The manor house glowing in afternoon sun, cars already lining the circular drive. An auction company had set up in the main hall, with tagged items arranged for viewing. Numbered paddles were being distributed to potential bidders. I parked my Subaru in the back, near the service entrance, and walked around to the main entrance like any other guest. The auctioneer was a professional, crisp suit, practiced patter, the kind of person who made bidding feel like a blood sport. A crowd had gathered, estate sale regulars, antique dealers, and my family, positioned near the front like royalty surveying their domain. Victoria saw me first. "Charlene, you came. Wouldn't miss it. I'm glad, this is difficult for all of us." She gestured to the assembled items. My father's desk, his art collection, furniture that had filled this house for decades. But we must be practical. Julian was examining an antique writing desk, running his hand over the mahogany surface. "This is beautiful. Dad always loved this piece." "You should bid on it," Victoria suggested. "Keep it in the family." "I might, depends on the price." Brittany was studying the oil paintings, several landscapes by minor but collectible artists. "These would look perfect in our entry hall." The auctioneer called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Before we begin, I want to offer family members the opportunity for first selection of items, as is customary in estate sales. Would any family members like to designate pieces for direct purchase before we start the auction?" Victoria nodded graciously. "How thoughtful." Julian raised his hand. "I'd like the antique desk, the mahogany one from the study." "Noted," the auctioneer said, marking something on his tablet. Brittany spoke up. "The oil paintings, all 3 landscapes, I'd like those." "Also noted." Victoria looked at me expectantly. The crowd was watching too, curious about the plainly dressed woman in the back who was apparently also family. "Charlene?" Victoria's voice carried across the hall. "You can have whatever's left after the sale. The damaged stuff nobody bids on." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sympathetic, embarrassed murmurs. I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. The culmination of years of quiet observation, of letting them underestimate me, of watching them construct elaborate fantasies about their own importance. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Actually," I said clearly, "there's a problem with this entire sale." Victoria's expression tightened. "What kind of problem?" "A legal one. None of these items can be sold." "That's absurd. These are personal effects. I'm the widow. I have every right." "You have the right to remove personal property." I agreed. "But you don't have the right to sell property that belongs to the estate owner." "The estate was your father's." "No," I said quietly, "it wasn't." The auctioneer was looking at his tablet, confused. He tapped something, frowned, tapped again. "I'm sorry, there seems to be— Can someone explain what's happening?" "The estate was sold last year," I said, "to the Valiant Trust. Everything in this house, the furniture, the art, the fixtures, all of it transferred with the property. It belongs to the trust now, not to my father's estate." Victoria's face was flushing red. "That's not. We went over this. The trust owns the land and building, but the contents." "The deed transfer was explicit," I said. "All contents, fixtures, and chattels. My father's attorney can verify this. Mr. Hutchins?" Hutchins had been standing near the back. He stepped forward reluctantly. "Ms. Crane is correct. The transfer included all contents. I reviewed the documents again this week to be certain." The auctioneer was shaking his head. "Then this entire sale is— We can't proceed, not without authorization from the trust owner." "Who is the trust owner?" Victoria demanded. "Someone must know. We'll contact them. Get authorization." "The trust is structured for privacy," Hutchins said. "The owner's identity is protected." Quote. Julian was staring at me now, really staring. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. "Charlene, you keep showing up with information about this trust. Very detailed information." I did my research. "No one does this much research unless they have a personal stake." The crowd had gone silent. The auctioneer was looking between me and Victoria like he'd stumbled into a family drama far beyond his pay grade. Brittany spoke up, her voice shrill. "Are you saying you know who owns the trust?" "I'm saying the trust's ownership is a matter of public record. If you'd bothered to look." "Then tell us." Victoria's composure was cracking. "Tell us who bought our family estate." This was the moment, the perfect, crystalline moment I'd been orchestrating for weeks. I could walk away now, let them discover the truth through paperwork and attorneys, keep my anonymity intact. But where was the art in that? The Valiant Trust, I said clearly, is a legal entity registered in Delaware. Its sole trustee and beneficiary is Captain Charlene Crane, United States Navy. The estate was purchased 13 months ago for $4.2 million, paid in full, with funds accumulated through 24 years of naval service, combat pay, housing allowances, and careful investment strategies. The silence was absolute. Victoria's champagne glass, she'd been holding it throughout the proceedings, slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet. You? Julian's voice came out strangled. You own the estate? Yes. That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. I'm a Navy captain with over 2 decades of service. I command a guided missile destroyer. I make $130,000 base pay, plus housing allowances, sea pay, and various other benefits. I've invested wisely. I bought property in San Diego during the 2008 crisis. I live below my means, and yes, I have that kind of money. Brittany was shaking her head. But you drive a Subaru. You shop at Nordstrom Rack. You stayed at a Holiday Inn. Because I choose to. Because operational security in my position means not drawing attention to personal wealth. Because I learned a long time ago that people reveal more about themselves when they think you're beneath them. The auctioneer looked at me with new respect. Ma'am, I need to verify. You're saying you own this entire estate? I pulled out my phone and opened an email from my attorney, turning the screen so he could see. Deed transfer. Trust documents, all properly filed and recorded. I am the legal owner of this property and all its contents. He read carefully, then nodded. This appears to be legitimate, in which case this auction cannot proceed without your authorization. Which I do not give, I said calmly. Victoria had gone white. She was gripping the back of a chair for support. You bought our home. You've been letting us live here, thinking it was ours, while I owned it, yes. Why? Her voice broke on the word. Why would you do that? Because Dad was going bankrupt. Because he was too proud to ask for help. Because I could afford to help and chose to do it in a way that preserved his dignity. By deceiving him? By saving him from financial ruin while letting him maintain his sense of self. He died believing he still owned this place. Would you rather he died knowing he'd lost everything? The question hung there, unanswerable. Julian had sunk into a chair. All these years, all the times we talked about your modest Navy salary and your steady government job. I have a modest salary by some standards, and it is steady government work. You just never bothered to understand what a Navy captain actually does or earns. You let us think you were struggling. I never said I was struggling. You assumed it. You needed it to be true so you could feel superior, so you could have something to pity, something to lord over. And I let you, because it was easier than explaining. And because watching you condescend to me while I owned your childhood home became its own form of entertainment. Brittany made a small sound, something between a sob and a gasp. The crowd was watching with the fascination of people witnessing something they knew they shouldn't be seeing but couldn't look away from. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Captain Crane, what would you like to do about the auction? Cancel it. Everything stays where it is. And the family members? Mrs. Victoria Crane has been given 60 days to vacate. She can have 90, I said. That should be sufficient time to find new accommodations. Victoria's face crumpled. Real tears now, not the decorative kind she displayed at the funeral. You're evicting me? You were going to sell my property without permission. What did you expect? I thought it was ours. It was never yours. It was Dad's. Then it was mine. You were a tenant, Victoria, a temporary one. Julian stood abruptly. This is cruel, Charlene. Whatever we said, whatever we did. Cruel? I kept my voice level. I saved this estate. I preserved Dad's legacy. I kept him from dying in bankruptcy. And I did it all while you 3 patronized me, dismissed my career, and treated me like a charity case. So forgive me if I don't feel particularly generous about letting you auction off my property. What happens to Dad's things? Brittany asked quietly. The books, the medals, the personal items? They'll be distributed according to his will. You'll get what he wanted you to have. Everything else stays with the estate. And the estate? What will you do with it? I looked around the hall. The portrait in the entrance, the rooms full of memory and history, the weight of decades pressing down from every surface. Haven't decided yet. Maybe I'll keep it. Maybe I'll sell it. Maybe I'll turn it into a home for retired Navy personnel. I have options now. Because you own it, Julian said bitterly. Because I own it, I agreed. Victoria had started to cry in earnest now, shoulders shaking, mascara running. Several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable. The auctioneer was packing up his equipment. Captain Crane, I'll need you to sign some paperwork confirming the cancellation. I followed him to his table, very aware of my family's eyes on my back. Behind me, I heard Julian say quietly, I can't believe she let us go on like that. All those years. And Brittany's response, I can't believe we never bothered to ask what she actually did. To really ask. I signed the paperwork and walked out through the main entrance, past the portrait that still showed me as a shadow in the corner, past the assembled guests who parted to let me through with new deference in their eyes. My Subaru waited in the back, unremarkable and unchanged. I drove back to Norfolk, back to my ship, back to the world where my rank meant something tangible and my achievements were measured in nautical miles and successful operations rather than real estate portfolios and antique furniture. 3 days later, Victoria's attorney contacted mine with a request for extended tenancy, 6 months instead of 90 days. I agreed. There was no satisfaction in making her homeless. Julian sent an email. I don't know how to process this. You're a stranger to me. I thought I knew you, but you've been someone else this whole time. I didn't respond. He was right. He didn't know me, but that was his fault, not mine. Brittany called. I let it go to voicemail. Listen to her message. I'm sorry. For everything. For not asking. For assuming. For treating you like you were less than. You deserved better from us. Maybe I did, but I'd stopped needing their validation years ago. The estate sits now in legal limbo while I decide its fate. I visit occasionally, walking through rooms that belong to me but feel like they belong to ghosts. My father's ghost. My mother's ghost. The ghost of the daughter I used to be before I learned that invisibility could be power. Sometimes I stand in front of that portrait and look at the girl in the corner, slightly out of focus, already learning to disappear. She's smiling in the painting. I never noticed that before. She's smiling because she knew something the others didn't. She knew that the damaged stuff nobody bids on sometimes turns out to be the most valuable piece in the collection. You just have to know what you're looking at. And I've always been very good at seeing